day, just a time when everybody was going to bed, there was a headline in the London Times which also said that the Ukrainians are rapidly running out of supplies. Anyway, that's the generality of the information I'm getting. Alex, over to you.
Okay, well, let me just give you what I've got on Kiev, because I know you've got a lot to say on Kiev and what's going on in the UK media. I concur fully with what you said on Kiev, that these victories are, and I quote from sources, these are virtual victories. Now, a couple of things. There were British, once again, what the Russians call British mercenaries, what I would imagine the British and the Kiev probably call is British army officials or NATO army officials, okay, depending on what side you're on. That's, use the words accordingly that you want to use. We've got the names of these British soldiers, which is terrible. I'm not going to say the names of these guys, but I think it's terrible that they're giving their names, number one. I think it's terrible that they're creating TikTok videos, number two. This is very dangerous, very dangerous. They're being encouraged to do this. I wish someone in the British government would tell these guys to get out of Kiev, or at a very bare minimum, stop. Stop using your cell phone. Stop creating these ridiculous TikTok videos. Stop bragging about bridges that you claim you've won over the Russian army, when in fact the Russian army didn't even care about these bridges. I mean, they weren't even there. They didn't even have these bridges. In other words, the information that I'm getting corroborates what you said in the intro, Alexander, in that the Russians, what they're concerned about with Kiev is just keeping Kiev surrounded and bottled up while they focus on where the real fighting is taking place. And that's all they're concerned about at this moment in time. Meanwhile, you have these British soldiers who are giving all their information via TikTok. And they're claiming these incredible victories over Putin and the Russians. And we saw what happened last time. These mercenaries or these soldiers were giving their information in the west of Lviv. We saw what the Russians did when they wanted to do it. This is what I'm worried about. So people like Liz Truss and these British officials need to tell these soldiers to get the hell out of Ukraine and get back home, because what they're doing is extremely dangerous, and the Russians are not taking any actions against them because they simply don't want to. They're very happy with just keeping Kiev as is, encircled. Every now and then there'll be some fighting, or there'll be a missile strike at an ammo depot or something, but they're just keeping it contained while the rest of the fight, while they're cleaning up, while they're mopping up everything in the east. That's the assessment that I've got. What do you got?
That's exactly the same assessment as I've got. I mean, the basic point is that they want to pin down Ukrainian forces around Kiev, because, of course, the Ukrainians can't afford to abandon Kiev, so that they don't reinforce the forces in eastern Ukraine. And that's what those Russian troops are doing outside Kiev. They're also there to exert pressure on what's left of the Ukrainian government, that whether it actually functioning in Kiev at all is a moot point. But I completely agree, and I'm going to say something. I mean, there was talk about Ukrainians capturing a town yesterday near Kiev. And I went through, the information that I had previously. It was a place called Mercouris, and I couldn't find any information that the Russians had ever captured it. So the Ukrainians recaptured something which either it was captured very briefly or it had not been captured at all. The last piece of information I got about that place before those claims was that the Russians had sent troops to surround it, and that was in the morning of the day that the Ukrainians claimed to have recaptured it. Now, I'm not on the ground. I'm not able to say exactly what's going on in these places, but the reality is, and I think this is something that I can say with absolute confidence, that the overall situation in and around Kiev is static. That is how the Russians want it. They're not looking for some great epic battle in Kiev. It's not their plan at the moment. Their focus is on Donbass at this precise moment in time, on the three important sectors in Donbass. One, of course, is Mariupol, where there's a really hard fight against what are probably the best motivated soldiers in the Ukrainian armed forces, the people from the famous battalion who are now increasingly bottled up and they're taking very heavy casualties. Further north, much further north, in the area of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which apparently the Ukrainian forces there are almost completely encircled. And the biggest force of all, the Ukrainian forces camped outside Donetsk, the capital of the Donetsk region, which has obviously always been in militia control ever since the events of 2014. And the reports there are that force is steadily, incrementally being surrounded as well. And as I said, even the London Times was admitting yesterday that the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition, of supplies, of fuel oil, of all of these things. So that's where the real battle is. What's going on in Kiev is theatre. That's all it is at the moment. It serves the Russian purposes, political, that, they're on, the outskirts of Kiev, and that puts pressure on whatever government is still functioning there. And also it keeps large numbers of Ukrainian troops, such as they are, tied down so that they can't participate in the really key battle, which is in Donbass.
Tied down, there's no way that the Ukraine military can mount a cohesive retaliation or counteroffensive. Their military is broken up. The communication lines are destroyed. The ammo depots are getting destroyed. Every day you're getting hundreds and hundreds of Russian fighter jets flying at night in these sorties and just destroying ammo depots, supply lines, you name it, all the logistic capability of the Ukraine army every single night is just getting demolished. And every now and then you're getting one of these missile strikes, one of these hypersonic missile strikes, which is just obliterating whatever target it sets its sights on. My question is, and you summed up the situation in the East very well, before I update, or actually let me just do a quick update on Mariupol. I have a map which I'll put up on the screen right now, which in your video, you said 50% of Mariupol was now cleared out, according to the Donetsk People's Republic. I've got a lot of credible maps and sources, and I think this map is very, very credible. Is 70% now of the city center has pretty much been cleared out. It's just a matter of time. It is just a matter of time. My question, though, to you is, why is the UK media and why is the UK government not telling these soldiers in Kiev the truth? Why are they egging them on? Why don't they pull them out of there? I mean, get home. Come west, get to Poland, get home.
Yes, I am utterly baffled by it. I'm utterly dismayed by it. I think it's a terrible thing. And can I just quickly say that I think that whatever game the British government is playing is a totally irresponsible one. And there will eventually be a political price to pay for it in Britain. I think when people in Britain wake up to the realities and to what the British government and the political class have been doing, I think that they will be extremely angry. And of course, the families of these people, if anything happens to them, which God forbid, they will be even more angry too. But can I just say, why is the British government doing it? And I'm going to make a guess, and it's just a guess, pure guess, which is that the Johnson government, ever since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, has been constantly, feverishly looking for ways to put Britain, to position Britain as a global player. So we had incredibly provocative things like sending a frigate close to Sevastopol, sending the HMS Queen Elizabeth to the South China Sea, all of these extraordinary wild gestures, and criticizing the US pullout from Afghanistan and pretending that Britain could go it alone in Afghanistan without the US, which is nonsense. And I think that they're trying to keep this crisis going because it makes them believe that as a result, Britain is leading in some way. If you go to the British media, particularly to those parts of the media which support the British government, you get the sense that, as I said, they're believing, they're telling themselves, we are the leaders here. We are leading the fight back against Putin and Russia. We are the people who are pushing for the sanctions against Russia in Europe. We were the people who persuaded everybody to disconnect Russian banks from the SWIFT system, for example, that we are leading in this fight. And that somehow seems to play up to this desperate urge that the British government has after Brexit to try to make itself look important. I think this is very connected with Brexit. I think you have a political class which felt somehow disconnected from Europe, uncertain what it wanted to do, and now they're trying to make themselves relevant again by taking all these very hardline positions. And of course, if you're talking about the Remainer part of the political class, which remember is the dominant part, they want to do it as well because it's their way of getting Britain in a kind of way back within the European security, political and economic systems. There was even an article somewhere, I think it was in the New Statesman, which actually stated straight away and very openly, Ukraine has cancelled Brexit.
Exactly. That's exactly what it's done. Now, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the options that are on the table for the collective West, for the Biden White House, and for NATO. Biden's going to be in Brussels on the 25th, and the topic is, of course, an emergency meeting about Ukraine. He's also going to be making a stop in Warsaw, and I'm not really sure exactly what they're going to be strategizing, what they're going to be discussing, but let's discuss it here. I only think there's three options left, in my opinion. Option number for the Biden White House, for NATO, the collective West. Option number one is just let it play out as it is, and the result is a Russian victory. That's a done deal, in my opinion. I think it's over. That's my opinion. What that looks like, what territory Russia gets, or how Russia decides to end this, I don't know, but it is going to be a Russian victory. So they can just, continue the rhetoric but not do anything. That's option number one. Option number two is to try and create some sort of false flag or no-fly zone in order to get either certain NATO countries involved, or the U.S. involved, or NATO as an alliance involved, or something like that. Escalate, in other words. Try to figure out a way to escalate. That's the option number two, a very dangerous option. Option number three is something that I thought was just rumor a couple of days ago and yesterday, but it could be on the table. And I just wonder what Russia's reaction would be to it if it did take place. And that would be to try and get Poland, of course, with the backing of the United States, to at least grab something from Ukraine. In other words, the military victory, the victory of Russia, is inevitable. But while we still have the chance, let's grab Lviv and let's grab parts that are historically ours, or that we feel we can jump in and take before Russia decides to move further west, if they're going to move further west. Of course, I want to stress, I don't have information about this. A lot of this is just, I don't want to say rumors, but I think it's past rumors now. I think there's a lot of credible analysts that are talking about this. What do you make of the three options that I've just laid out?
I think you've outlined them very well. And can I just make one brief observation before we discuss them? 3 weeks ago, when all this started, we were saying on these programs, and I was saying, and it was my belief, that the United States had made significant gains out of this crisis, and that it had managed to win quite a few trumps, and it was actually looking as if, on balance, the US was doing well out of this crisis. With every single day that's passing, those gains, to the extent that they were ever real at all, are starting to melt away. And I think that the US has, the administration, I should say, has overplayed its hand, and it risks doing that even further. Now, the wise course, the only sensible course, is to let this thing play out. Now, I have to say doing so comes with a political cost. There is already criticism of the administration in Britain that it is weak and that it is unable to do things that will reverse the tide of events. But I think that there is no appetite on the part of the major European powers, Germany and France, for anything like a no-fly zone. I think that after a certain wobble, opinion is now starting to harden against this. That's certainly true in France. I suspect it's beginning to become increasingly true in Germany as well. So even if this all ends in a Ukrainian defeat, which it will if things are left to play out, even if the administration starts to look weak, even if the gains it thought it was making starts to fizzle out because the administration gave such bad signals earlier in the crisis that it would be able to do things to Russia, which it clearly hasn't been able to do. Still, I think that's the best option. The problem is, and we said this so many times, this administration is dominated by neocons, and neocons have no reverse gear. So I think that escalation to a no-fly zone and those sort of things, I think that's not going to happen, because I think that key NATO states like Germany and France will not countenance it, and I think the Pentagon is adamantly opposed. But I think the third option, which is the Polish force into Western Ukraine, is now becoming a distinct possibility. Now, it's not just speculation and rumour. It was actually proposed formally by Jarosław Kaczynski, who is the Deputy Prime Minister of Poland and who everybody knows is the real dominant force within the Polish government. He is an unreconstructed Polish nationalist of the pre-Second World War variety. He is one of those people who still yearns to regain control of Western Ukraine. I'm sure of this, because that was part of Poland before the Second World War. And I can see that he might start to agitate about this, say that's what he wants to do, tell Biden when Biden goes to Warsaw that that's what the Poles want to do, and it's conceivable. I think it is highly likely that they might do that. I'm getting more and more reports that this is now being seriously floated or considered. Certainly in Poland, it's been taken very seriously. The Germans are known to be opposed to it. The Russians have warned against it. But looking at this from the other side of the calculus, looking at this from the Russian side, going back to what Putin said on the day that he recognized the two independent republics of Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, he spoke about Western Ukraine in that speech as if it had properly belonged to Poland. I don't think the Russians have any particular strong feelings about places like Lviv. And I think they know perfectly well that the Ukrainians there are adamantly and implacably opposed to reunification with Russia, which, bear in mind, only happened under the Soviet Union, and that they would really resist and, talk about, insurrection, a guerrilla war there might actually be real. So I've never been convinced that the Russians really have any plans to go to Lviv. They might oppose a Polish intervention into Western Ukraine, to places around Lviv. But I don't think, but perhaps in private, they might not be so hostile to it as many people expect. The one thing I would say about this venture is that, of course, if the Poles do enter Lviv, then what are they going to do there? Are they going to try and set up a kind of Polish protectorate, a kind of Ukraine, but controlled by Poland and the Polish military? Or are they looking ultimately to annex this territory and to rejoin it to Poland? In either case, I suspect that what they will find is that they're not welcome there either. And though at the moment Western Ukrainians are hostile to Russia, I suspect that over time they would become hostile to Poland as well. So I don't think this is a good plan for Poland. I think it would lead Poland to disaster. I think they would be far better advised to leave well alone. But I'm not saying it won't happen. I'm not saying that the Russians will try to stop it. And I think it's entirely possible that the Biden administration, despite deep misgivings from Germany and France, might give it the green light. Of course, if it happens, then the breakup of Ukraine, the partition of Ukraine, takes a giant leap further forward. And in fact, at that point, the disintegration of the Ukraine that we have known suddenly starts to look like a reality. And the Ukrainian government is already accusing Hungary of seeking to take control of parts of Ukraine's territory.
Yeah, well, we talked about the Carpathian Rus and how they want out of this Ukraine conflict. They want autonomy, and so that's something to consider. If Poland were to intervene, would you believe that they would have some sort of backdoor communication with Russia to coordinate so that there isn't a tripwire between NATO and Russia? I mean, my point is, I understand the surprise element of Poland rushing in there, but on the same level, there would have to be some communication between the military officials to say, okay, we're moving in, we're just going to go this far, or to avoid NATO coming in conflict with Russia.
If the Poles have any sense, that's exactly what they will do. They will tell the Russians in advance, and they will set up what's called a deconfliction hotline with the Russian military to avoid a clash with the Russians and to try to sort of agree this in advance with the Russians. The problem is with someone like Kaczynski, Kaczynski, I don't want to be entirely critical of him. I mean, he is a gifted politician, and, he's somebody who's has his strengths, but on Russia, he is completely visceral. I mean, he loathes Russia. He believes the Russians killed his brother, wrongly, by the way, but that's what he thinks. So, I mean, he's the kind of person who might rush in without working things out with the Russians in advance. Now, I hope that people in Poland, the people around him, the Polish military, if they're ordered to do this thing, tell him and tell the other Polish officials, Morawiecki and Duda, that, we've got to liaise with the Russians in advance before we take this step. Because to be absolutely clear about this, if we go into Western Ukraine, we're not going there as a NATO force, because that's essentially been ruled out. Germany and France have said that's not going to happen. So we would be going into, and in fact, I understand legally speaking, it can't happen. NATO can't do it under its charter without the authorization of the UN Security Council. So, I mean, it's not going to be a NATO force. It will be a Polish force. And in that case, since it will be out of NATO territory, it is not protected by NATO. There's no legal obligation on the part of NATO to protect it under Article 5. And at that point, if there's a battle between the Poles and the Russians in Western Ukraine, the Poles could very well find themselves on their own. And of course, they don't have defenses against hypersonic missiles. Even NATO, even the US doesn't. So the Russians have hypersonic missiles. They've used them in Ukraine. So I think in their own interests, if the Poles are thinking of making this kind of move, they should discuss it with the Russians first. To be very clear, I think it's an extremely bad idea on any terms, on any basis. I mean, Western Ukraine was a major problem for Poland in the interwar period. I think it'd be an even worse problem now. But, if they're going to do this, I think, extremely foolish, unwise, and wrong thing. At least mitigate the consequences by sorting it out with the Russians first. But I'm not convinced they will do it.
All right. So Russia's gains in Ukraine. We've talked a lot about this. Putin has given his terms to Zelensky, and his terms are very specific: recognize Crimea, recognize Donetsk, Lugansk, denazify, and of course neutrality. No NATO, completely neutral. But Russia has gained a lot of territory, and it's come at a cost. And that territory is most of it is Russian speaking. My own personal opinion is a lot of the residents there would not be hostile to some sort of Russian influenced state, whether that's Ukraine or whether that's something else. I'm not going to go there for now. We just don't know. But we had news this morning that Kherson, which is one of the regions, the Kherson and the province there, which is on the south, on the Sea of Azov and close to Odessa and the Black Sea, an important city, is now going to be switching to rubles as its currency. And when I read that, I said, okay, this is another indication that even though we have Putin's terms that he's given Zelensky, I believe that even if Zelensky were to agree to all those terms unconditionally, I agree to everything, even then, I still don't think that Russia would be giving back those territories that it has won over, especially those territories which are of Russian culture or Russian speaking. I'm not saying that Russia's going to annex these territories, but I really don't think that they're going to say, okay, we're just going to move out and now Kherson and all these regions just go back to the administrative control of Kiev and the Kiev government, unless, of course, they control, in the future, they end up controlling Kiev as well. But I saw that as an indication saying that, you know what, Putin has given his terms, but perhaps his terms may change in the next coming days. I don't know. What do you think of that?
I'm entirely in agreement. Can I just say, and this is, I think, something that some of our viewers do need to be aware of, because we hear all about, the Russian offensive having stalled and all these victories. The Russians, over the last 3 weeks, have taken control of more Ukrainian territory than the total land area of the United Kingdom. So, Ukraine, as Gonzalo Lira has pointed out, is actually a huge country. It's the second biggest in Europe after Russia itself. This may not be, in terms of, the overall size of Ukraine, more than 20% of its territory, but in actual physical terms, it's a huge amount of territory with a lot of people and a lot of facilities and cities and things of that kind. I don't believe the Russians are ever going to leave. I mean, that's my own personal view. I share exactly your own view. And I would remind people that Putin told Macron very early on over the course of this war that unless the Ukrainians came to terms on the terms that he specified, then the Russians reserve the right to escalate their demands to the point of calling into question Ukraine's statehood as we know it. So he's already left himself that maneuver space. Now, I don't think this is plan A at the moment, but the longer the Ukrainians hold out, the more difficult it becomes. And to be straightforward about it, I don't think Kherson region is ever going back to Ukraine in the form that it was before the war began.
Yeah, and I think that includes Mariupol and Donetsk, Lugansk. I mean, we need to remind people that Donetsk and Lugansk, they didn't have the whole province, the Russians, or at least the DPR and the LPR, they didn't have all of the province of Donetsk and Lugansk. Now it seems like they have the whole province in a totality, so I don't think that's going to go back either. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a few holdout places. There's Mariupol, obviously. There's the areas around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk and the north, and then there is Slavyansk-Kramatorsk region, which is in Donetsk, I believe, and which, by the way, was where the uprising against Kiev in 2014. That was where it was centered on in those two cities. If people remember the fighting at that time, a lot of it was around those two cities. But that's so there's cities of some symbolic significance for the Russians. But eventually they will get the whole of Donbass, Donetsk, Lugansk as well. They'll get Mariupol. All of those region, all that region will be under their control. I suspect Kherson will be under control too. Now, the big question is, if Ukraine persists in resisting, then Kharkiv, Nikolaev, all these other regions, also Russian-speaking, might also start to fall under Russian control too, Chernigov, and then perhaps eventually Odessa too. I don't see the Russians pulling back from any of these places once they take them. And I've said many times, I'm going to say it again, in some ways the most symbolic of all of these is Odessa, because of the enormous role Odessa has in Russian culture and modern Russian history. If Odessa falls under Russian control, I think it is all but inconceivable that the Russians will ever withdraw from it. So, Ukraine doesn't have unlimited time.
Yeah, and when you look at a map and you look at where Crimea is, you start to understand how important all those cities of Mariupol and Kherson and everything around there is important for securing the peninsula. I mean, the land bridge, the water, all of it.